Most people never realize they've already made the decision to stay exactly where they are. On a Tuesday morning in April 2019, Marcus Chen sat in his cubicle at a mid-sized insurance firm in Austin, Texas, scrolling through his phone during his 10th coffee break of the day. He was 32 years old, earned $58,000 a year, and had been in the same position for 6 years without a promotion. Marcus wasn't unhappy, exactly. He had health insurance, a predictable schedule, and enough money to pay rent on his one-bedroom apartment, with a little left over for weekend takeout. What bothered him, when he allowed himself to think about it, was the spreadsheet he'd created 3 years earlier titled 5-Year Plan that still sat untouched in his documents folder. That morning, his college roommate Jake posted photos from Barcelona. Jake had quit his accounting job 2 years prior to start a digital marketing agency and now worked remotely from wherever he wanted. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd felt dozens of times before when comparing his life to others who'd taken bigger risks. He closed Instagram, opened a new browser tab, typed "How to Start a Business" into the search bar, stared at the results for exactly 43 seconds, then closed the tab and returned to processing claim forms. This cycle, inspiration followed by immediate retreat, had repeated itself roughly once a month for the past 4 years. If you found this video useful, please consider subscribing, liking, sharing, and leaving a comment. It helps the channel grow and allows us to continue producing documentary-style content like this. Behavioral economists have a term for what Marcus was experiencing. They call it the satisficing trap, a portmanteau of satisfy and suffice, coined by Herbert Simon in 1956. The concept describes how humans, when faced with complex decisions, tend to choose the first option that meets their minimum acceptable threshold rather than searching for the optimal solution. In Marcus's case, his $58,000 salary wasn't great, but it was enough to cover his basic needs plus minor luxuries, which created what psychologists call a local maximum, a comfortable plateau that feels like success compared to worse alternatives, but falls short of actual potential. A 2017 study from Princeton University analyzed career trajectories of 43,000 professionals and found that 68% remained within 15% of their starting salary bracket for over a decade, regardless of industry or education level. The researchers identified 3 primary factors that kept people locked in these patterns: the sunk cost fallacy regarding years already invested, the familiarity bias that made current roles feel safer than unknown alternatives, and what they termed comfort debt, the accumulation of small lifestyle expenses that required consistent income. Marcus had accumulated significant comfort debt without realizing it. A car payment of $312 monthly, a gym membership he used twice a month, 3 streaming services, and a habit of ordering lunch delivery that cost roughly $200 weekly. None of these expenses were individually significant, but collectively they created a financial baseline that required his current salary, making any career risk feel exponentially more dangerous. The human brain, evolved for survival rather than optimization, interprets this situation through an ancient risk assessment mechanism called loss aversion, discovered by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in 1979. Their research demonstrated that humans feel the pain of losing something roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of gaining something of equal value, which means the fear of losing Marcus's predictable $58,000 outweighed the appeal of potentially earning more through entrepreneurship. Organizations unconsciously exploit this psychological quirk by structuring employment to maximize comfort just above the threshold of dissatisfaction. Benefits packages, annual cost of living raises, casual Fridays, and birthday cake in the break room. 3 months after the Barcelona incident, Marcus attended his company's annual review meeting, where his manager, Patricia, praised his consistent performance and offered him a 2.3% raise, bringing his salary to $59,334. Marcus said thank you, shook Patricia's hand, and felt a quiet disappointment that he couldn't quite articulate settle somewhere behind his ribs. What he didn't know was that this moment represented a critical junction that behavioral scientists call a micro-surrender, a small decision to accept less than desired that makes subsequent surrenders incrementally easier. A longitudinal study from Stanford tracked 5,000 professionals over 15 years and discovered that each time someone accepted a mediocre outcome without negotiation, their likelihood of advocating for themselves in the next opportunity decreased by an average of 14%. The researchers termed this phenomenon aspiration erosion, noting that it operated almost invisibly. Subjects rarely recognized their own diminishing expectations until explicitly confronted with their earlier goals. Marcus had stopped opening his 5-year plan document entirely by November 2019, and by February 2020, he'd forgotten it existed. When the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted his routine 6 months later, forcing remote work and economic uncertainty, Marcus felt relieved that he'd chosen stability over the riskier entrepreneurial path he'd briefly considered. This rationalization, reframing inaction as wisdom in hindsight, is what psychologist Leon Festinger identified in 1957 as cognitive dissonance reduction, the mind's automatic process of reshaping beliefs to align with behaviors rather than changing behaviors to align with beliefs. By 2022, Marcus was 35 years old, earning $62,000 annually, and had been with the same company for 9 years without ever working on a project that excited him. He'd mastered the art of appearing engaged during meetings while mentally planning his grocery shopping, a skill that required more creative energy than his actual job responsibilities. The opportunity cost of this arrangement, the value of what Marcus could have built or become with that same 9 years of effort, was incalculable but substantial. On a Thursday evening in October 2023, Marcus scrolled through LinkedIn and saw that his college roommate Jake had sold his digital marketing agency for an undisclosed amount that industry analysts estimated between $3 and $7 million. Marcus felt the familiar chest tightness, but this time it was accompanied by something sharper and more difficult to dismiss, the dawning awareness that he'd been making the same choice repeatedly for a decade. He opened a new document and titled it, "What I've Actually Done," then spent 47 minutes staring at the blank page before closing his laptop. The distinction between contentment and complacency, Marcus was beginning to realize, wasn't always obvious in the moment. It only became clear when examining the gap between early aspirations and eventual outcomes. Research from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School found that the most common regret among professionals over 50 wasn't failed attempts at ambitious goals, but rather the realization that they'd never seriously attempted them at all. The study's lead researcher noted that people consistently overestimated the risk of trying and underestimated the cost of perpetual safety, creating what she termed the inversion of regret. Marcus wasn't unique. Millions of people worldwide had made similar calculations, chosen similar comforts, and arrived at similar crossroads where the accumulated weight of small surrenders became impossible to ignore. The question wasn't whether his job was bad or his life was wrong. The question was whether he'd someday look back and wonder what might have happened if he'd been willing to trade comfort for the uncertainty of genuine pursuit. That night, Marcus didn't open his laptop to research business ideas, or update his resume, or calculate the financial requirements for a career change. He simply sat on his couch in his one-bedroom apartment, ate leftover pad thai from Tuesday, and acknowledged for the first time that choosing not to decide was itself a decision, with consequences he'd be living with long after the comfort stopped feeling comfortable.